to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, what does the education system actually teach? Is its main teaching role its formal doctrines? Maybe you wish to critique its sort of promotion of SJWism or liberalism, etc., etc. Is that what it primarily actually teaches? Or is it the way in which it teaches those which is the main teachable aspect to the system? Is it the bells? Is it the segregation? Is that what it primarily teaches? Tim, what do you think?
Well, I want to start off with first of all, I think that universities are some of the most under-critiqued organization in society, and by far, and considering it's set up, as you point out, the bells and all those formats, it's extremely under-critiqued. It's basically a factory in some ways. The public school systems which exist in varying forms throughout the developed world and in the developing world too. You have a sort of Prussian master in front of the room. They sit in rows. And there's some variations. You have the Montessori people, but the form roughly remains the same. And even in Christian and religious schools, the form is roughly the same. They might teach slightly different content, but nonetheless, the actual form and setup is about the same. You have the Illich's book Deschooling, which is a fairly interesting read as well. And that's one of the few critiques of it. You have Bryan Caplan's case against education, and you have the sort of homeschooling movement. But in general, I would say education as an institution is fairly under-critiqued and sort of just exists. It just sort of just exists there. And one of the reasons I think it exists is because the people that are generally tasked with the job of critiquing things, which is what university professors and those things generally have sort of carved out as their niche, are in that very spot. So as Upton Sinclair would say, it's very hard to persuade somebody into believing something when their salary is dependent on not believing it. So if college professors would and high school teachers, middle school teachers, elementary school teachers would come to this understanding to a certain extent, they would realize that they're one of them. They're one of the evil oppressors, possibly the quote oppressor class. In a way. Now, again, this gets somewhat complicated and nuanced as well. But I think of sort of stating the obvious. Stating the obvious, I think, is a fairly open forward thing that must be stated before we go any further. And as far as like college professors themselves are concerned, there's some surveys about them. Their politics generally lean left. Now, it is worth lean left to far left. Now, it is worth pointing out that historically this might not have been the case. There are reports that universities used to be more quote-unquote conservative. I'm somewhat suspicious of that. I'm somewhat not suspicious of that. But nonetheless, the whole, and particularly the Anglosphere, United States, Britain, and its English-speaking world, the role of universities is have a quite high setting in society. If someone says they're a college professor, it's not like saying you're a day laborer or something like that. You're given a certain clout and so forth. So again, one of the reasons I think the people in this institution don't criticize this institution. You get a few outliers like Bryan Caplan, Ivan Illich, as well as Thaddeus Russell, as well as Michel Foucault in a way as well. But in general, they're very uncritical of this organization. And as far as the institution itself is one of my curiosities, what exactly is the purpose of it? And this is where university professors, I'd argue, are some of the biggest advocates or operators in what the left would call, have you Eastern Roundtable, the neoliberal machine. I mean, they're in some ways the front men, the job of convincing everyone or subordinating everyone. And here's Dallas Willard. I think Dallas Willard, as far as telos is concerned, is one of the best theorists. He's a Christian apologist who I like a lot. And this is in one of his great lectures. Nietzsche leaves us, and he's going to quote Nietzsche. Nietzsche leaves us in a position where, for an example, in a university setting, about the only thing that we can appeal to in recommending our university is the degree of personal success someone may have if he or she studies with us. A few remarks may be made about the community, almost nothing will be said about family, but a lot will be said about individual creativity and the capacity to exercise judgments that will be valued, and how people will pay a graduate a lot of money to work for them. That's a natural outcome of the picture of the enclosed mind and the will turned back on itself that naturally comes out of Nietzsche. I don't want to dump on Nietzsche. He was not so much an instigator as a person to express what he had already come to a realization in his culture. Now, that Nietzsche, of course, is a German, but in this regard, Germany has very similar culture forces in Britain, United States, France, and to a large extent Japan, South Korea, as well elsewhere. So yeah, I would say that's one of the ironic things, and this is one of the things I always was thinking when I was in college courses, when I was hearing with these sort of slight left-leaning to far-left professors, not that were left-leaning professors, like, look, people. I was in a private institution, that would cost a lot of money. I was like, look, people are going into debt to pay you, maybe not you, but pay this institution to build up its clout, so you have a nice cushy job. In a way, a professor's job is a cushy job. So I always think it's sort of interesting that the whole package of what a university is. So I made some opening statements and comments about what I think. So far, what do you think about the Dallas Willard quote, as well as some of the other comments about how under-critiqued role? Is it because they have a privileged position, Swithin?
I think they do have a privileged position. The university and education system has basically replaced, to a large extent, the church in the moral compass, but also the epistemological one. How we have sort of modern scientism. We must see what the science says, what the academics say. This is where real truth can be found. This is not found within sort of ecclesiastical institutions, as it may have been thought earlier. And I suppose you could make the claim that even though, the universities were set up in the US, all of them were set up as sort of Protestant universities, the fact that they weren't sort of directly related to a church, I mean, you could say would encourage people who are not sort of theologically minded to try and create their sort of rival truth system through there. Which goes to your point about whether it was that much conservative in the past. It may be. That's just speculation on my part. You mentioned an interesting point about telos. What is the point of formal education system? Nobody really has a particularly great idea of what that actually is. Most people in the education system's main goal is getting them to ascend the rung of the ladder above them, because if the rung above them doesn't exist, then no one will go to them. So if you're in sort of like where I do a lot of stuff in sort of like in the American terms of high school, sort of 16 to 18, but the whole point is, you must go to university. This is what is sold, because if we didn't sell that, people go, what's the point of doing your stuff? It's like, I don't know, actually. But when it comes to sort of the actual practical purpose of the education system, as it's designed in England at least, the UK is basically to serve industry. That was where it originated from. Obviously, it existed early and had different purposes, that say, associated with the churches, etc. But the state education system, which started primarily in 1870 with the Forster Education Act, the main purpose behind this was effectively to provide free training for industry. If you listen to some of the quotes of the people who advocated the act in the late 19th century, it is exactly the same sorts of rhetoric that you would hear Tony Blair and Gordon Brown using 20 years ago about how we're living in a high-skill modern economy where we need knowledge and high skills to compete with the rest of the world. They were basically making exactly the same arguments in the late 19th century. And so what we needed these compulsory schools, free at the point of use, so that we would have highly skilled, trained people, and basically it was so the industry didn't have to pay them. This actually relates quite nicely to some sort of Marxist sociologists called Bowles and Gintis, who claim that actually what the education system teaches is not algebra, it's not history, it's not science, etc. That's effectively is secondary to its main purpose, which they call the main purpose is really the hidden curriculum. It's not the obvious ostensible curriculum that they're being taught. It's the real curriculum, the hidden one, which is where the real action is basically conformity. They see the education system as a way of entrenching class rule. So schools are incredibly authoritarian institutions. You have to do what your teacher says without question. The bell goes off. You've got to move at the time you're told to do. You could be in the middle of doing some interesting reading, writing, or something like that. But no, the bell goes. You have to go somewhere else. You are segregated by age. It is as if you have these factory batches. A factory produces, a batch in April, May, June, July, and this is effectively how children are socialized and put together in the schooling system by age, which makes it makes some sense. But obviously, of course, you have the problem, especially at the younger ages. If somebody is nearly 6 and someone's only just 5, well, that's a huge difference in sort of development ability. And this has been shown, I think, that the month of birth that does the best in the school year is like in October. And I think August does the worst, pretty much. But I think possibly largely due to that. So that, I would say, is what a lot of people do learn from that. And the reason I say that as well is if you ask people what they learned at school, they won't know. They'll remember very, very, very little. But what I think they do learn, and they do kind of remember, is the form, the way it works, which socializes them basically working for corporations, primarily, where you're just a cog in a machine and you have little sort of autonomy, as it were, which is somewhat ironic given the sort of like the ostensible laissez-faire university professor who's all about education, individualism, freedom. He's part of a system which basically means, well, if you don't like what he writes, you fail. For all his critique of consumer capitalism, there, as it were, when it comes to writing, your consumer is your university professor, and if you don't provide a product he likes, he just gives you a bad mark, which I think is somewhat ironic given the way they think of consumer capitalism as creating poor quality outcomes and products, etc. So yeah, I see the current education system as a subsidy for corporate interests primarily, and it socializes the child to fit in such organizations. I'm not sure what the origin of the public schools is in the US, but that's very much true of the UK situation.
The US, or I'm not 100% up on the US, the labyrinth of what exactly is the US public school system history, but nonetheless, I do think as far as higher education is concerned, it is rather ironic that considering the politics, 9 out of 10 professors are Democrats, or they're not Republicans, I should say. Something like 8 out of 10 professors are not Republican, which means they're libertarians, like one minority, Greens, or Democrats. So nonetheless, it is ironic that, as I said, they're sort of the front men for the very system that they claim to hate. And that's true historically. Although it's worth pointing out that the truly great intellectuals, and I've made this point before, generally worked outside of universities and were just funded, again, by like super wealthy businessmen. Wittgenstein's family, I think, was funded by, I think the Mises were funded by some wealthy people. I think Wittgenstein was from like the 5th wealthiest family in Austria at the time. Same way with Engels, same way with Marx. Same way with Darwin, same way with Nietzsche. Nietzsche quit university and basically died penniless. So the truly great, the cream de la crepe of historical intellects weren't really institutionalized, and that's just an interesting way to frame it. And actually Bryan Caplan points out that, and this is something Yaron Books also points out on the School Sucks podcast as well, is that if you view education as harmful, In a way, it's like a thing that hurts people, and that that it actually would hurt the weaker people more than it would hurt the stronger. So one of the possible effects of education is like, since it dulls people, the only truly creative people can really survive the system. And historically, from my understanding, someone like Aquinas or Socrates, my guess is they did not do well in school and they were not particularly popular. I could be wrong. I mean, Socrates died being forced to be poisoned. But I think in general, the true top, the greats, aren't really. They just need a stable job to keep them in. Actually, Nassim Taleb has this with the idea that with this idea of freedom, in the sense that in some ways a taxi cab, someone independent scholar, in some ways more free. This is one of the great things about the Protestant Reformation regarding the printing press, as well as recently about the internet. Hopefully, it doesn't get shut down for a variety of reasons. But nonetheless, I do think it's worth pointing out that the truly great intellectuals in history are primarily outside of it. And actually, the professors there are kind of mediocre people who, should probably be working for some corporation, but instead they're fronting the next generation inside of it. So yeah, I would say that actually is the purpose of it. And it's protecting this sort of class interest. You see with teachers unions as well. And so forth. But nonetheless, overall, those are my sort of opening statements about the teleology of education. And the purpose of it is unknown. I mean, I think historically it was religious. That's the reason that most of these universities in northeastern United States were set up as Protestants, started by Protestants to teach ministers. That's the original purpose. In a way, it's still true. They're just teaching ministers of a different religion. I think that's the same way with Oxford as well, that they were set up as minister training schools. And again, as you pointed out earlier, they just teach a different religion. It's more like scientism, social justice, other things like that. So as far that, so within any further comments on that, and then you can get into your more philosophy and the questions we've laid out here. Swithin?
Oh, what I was going to say was a lot of people in education will say, oh, no, we're not teaching ideology, we're not teaching views that you must hold. We are being neutral. We are just providing the information for the students to learn, and so then they become a critical thinker. Might be one of the arguments they may use. But the question arises, is it actually possible for university or college professors to actually be neutral, or just a standard school teacher? I mean, is it actually possible for you to provide sort of like a neutral setup? I mean, for one thing, I would say being neutral is boring. This is one of my objections to textbooks primarily. Textbooks in many cases attempt to provide a sort of comprehensive survey of certain views on certain subjects. So, for example, some of my students have studied, not with me, but have done sort of like politics, and look at sort of political ideology. And so the book will attempt to provide an overview of the thoughts of them. Now, obviously, it's quite limited in space. But, I mean, it does an okay job, but, I mean, you can tell by reading it kind of what they think, what is actually the beliefs of the author. You have to look a little bit closer at it, but you can tell that, which I think is fine. I just think it would probably be more interesting if the teachers, etc., didn't have the position that, oh no, I'm just telling you facts and no opinion, if you want to make that dichotomy. It'd be more interesting if they said, look, this is what I think, here's the arguments for it, and here's the arguments against it. And, if possible, I mean, this would be difficult in certain circumstances, but you get someone to make like a course at university on, I don't know, anarcho-capitalist society, for example, and then you go and get a communist to explain communism and argue against anarcho-capitalism, and vice versa. I think it'd be a far more interesting way of doing it. It'd be more stimulating as a student, and it'd be much more honest, because as much as you can attempt to try and be fair-handed, you're always going to be coming down on one side or another. And I think it's more sort of it's easier to see that if you know what the teacher's position is beforehand, rather than trying to just sort of work it out and, oh, that's why he's saying that. Another reason for that is it's rare that you can get somebody who doesn't advocate a position to appropriately steel man the position. They don't know it well enough. I mean, so for example, I was listening to an old podcast with Keith Woods, who I think now self-describes as a national Bolshevik, actually. But he was accusing Stefan Molyneux of having no leg to stand on when he was removed by YouTube, because he was just advocating, he was advocating non-aggression and the free market, and that's what YouTube did to him, and they disassociated from him, and so he had no argument against that. Well, if he'd known Stefan Molyneux's position, he would have been able to say that actually he makes an implicit contract argument, that originally YouTube set themselves as like a platform where anyone can basically say whatever they want, and that's he joined on those sort of terms. Now, whether you think that's a good idea or not, or a good argument on Molyneux's part or not, is not the point. The point is that when you have somebody attempting to provide views of another party, they'll generally do it very badly. And it's especially the case if you have very mainstream views, because you have very little reason to actually interact with any opposing viewpoints. You simply won't come across them. Whereas more dissident group thinkers will tend to do that. But again, those are the people who won't actually be in the formal education system. Oh, just a point on where all the best why all the best minds aren't in sort of formal education. Ed Dutton has done some work on what he calls genius, and he says basically geniuses have outlier high IQ and are moderately disagreeable. Those are some of the two aspects of it. And the fact that they're moderately disagreeable means that they don't get on within the university system. They come up with new ideas which threaten established interests, and so they simply don't do very well. He points to the fact, I think Einstein nearly failed his bachelor's. I can't remember exact details. I think one of the things was he had simply very little interest in what he was doing for his bachelor's. His interest was in sort of what would then become relativity theory, rather than the whole gamut of things you need to do in university, in sort of a standard bachelor's program. So that sort of moderate disagreeableness, I think, to a large extent explains why they don't fit in within sort of the university system. Tim, you were telling me a while ago about how you used to be able to sort of work out the political views of your college professors. George, can you want to sort of give an overview of how that worked and how that you think influenced what you were taught?
Oh yes, I starting in college, I started sort of recognizing this system was insane in certain ways. And one of the games I used to play in my head is, what exactly does this person vote for or would support? And I do this with other people too. But I think college professors are interesting because most universities claim neutrality, or at least try to claim neutrality, or in a way neutrality. And I'm one of those people that I don't really think neutrality exists. Maybe neutrality exists in mathematics, although if you look into theories of mathematics, it's not even clear that mathematics exists. You can quickly get to Platonism, which looks like Christian fundamentalism in a certain regard. So in that regard, I'm not really I'm suspicious of neutrality. But yeah, I would guess it, and then I would try to write papers when I needed a good grade. I once made up an entirely fake paper just to appease fake data, fake paper to appease a college professor who was probably a Bernie Sanders supporter, or I knew he was a pretty ardent never Trumper. Those were the only facts I could deduce from him. So you have to tailor the market is the professor, he's the boss and the consumer. In the sort of consumer economy known as the great economy, and you have to, you have to make demand meet the supply there, to get this arbitrary mark. And that's one of the best ways. I actually did very well. He said I wrote very well. Turns out the entire data was false. But nonetheless, I do think it is interesting to play. I think actually whether or not this is the case, I think some conservatives might actually try to do this. Which how well they do it is of some question. But this goes back to neutrality, where in this regard I am somewhat of a fringe person in the sense I don't really have that high agreeableness trait. If I had a high agreeable trait, I probably would be a high school teacher or a college professor. If I had a high, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast in a certain sense. But as far as the other points regarding, I don't. In some ways, I don't see a solution. My solution generally is to get rid of the subsidy. In this regard, I think the Protestant Reformation is a good model. Don't take the Lutheran option. Just take the, let 1,000 flowers bloom. And this goes back to sort of my anarchism in the sense that if people can't be trusted to run a government, to govern us. So if people can't be trusted to think for themselves, then why should we trust college professors to think for us or to guide us? Now people say, oh, this could lead to tyranny. This could lead to people believing anything you want, and it's like, well, this current system seems to, this is one of the things I'm always somewhat skeptical about, sort of the progressive advocates of education. And as you were pointing earlier, that a lot of the arguments in the the 1900s, we need this high tech economy. They're making the same arguments. So are we worse off educated now or higher educated? And that picture is complicated to tell. Are we better educated now than we were in the late 1800s? It depends on, of course, who you ask and who you went and who's judging and what criterion you're judging on. If you look at some of these test questions, like in the late 1800s, they were really tough. I think I was seeing them. But then again, different societies favor different things. It just comes back to teleology. I think one of the problems of modern societies is sort of an atheological society. It lacks a norm, and the only norm, as Willard points out, is consumerism. Which is multiplied by the ironicity of the fact that the college professors themselves claim to at least be claim to be against consumerism, yet most people are in college to make more money or as an insurance policy against being poor. And since that the best people that can pass it are the people that have a mixture of IQ and conformity, those are the skills basically needed. That it is a kind of a classist institution, as we opened up about that, which is one of the reasons why it probably doesn't get critiqued, and it has a lot of power and prestige, which is again the reason why it doesn't get critiqued. In this regard, it does function exactly like the Catholic Church did. Although Tom Woods was recently on with Thaddeus Russell, and they were going through his university. Tom Woods was discussing. He was in a Columbia class, and Tom Woods was he was a conservative there, and he was saying, they were talking about the history of the Great Depression, and he said there's some lunatics, and basically said there's some people who think that the Federal Reserve actually caused the Great Depression or something like that. And he said, now that's been largely discredited. And Tom Woods stood up there and gave, there is the guy named F.A. Hayek. He didn't mention Mises, but that has a counter argument to that. So it's worth pointing out that it's not clear, and this was 30 years ago. I can only imagine now. It's not clear that what exactly people of certain political persuasions get out of universities. And that's one of the points that Michael Malice brought up once he was on the Babylon Bee was interviewing. He was like, why do you let your kids in these public schools and universities? Why do people are so obsessed with spending a small fortune here in the United States, or getting the state to spend a relatively decent-sized fortune on education? That is a great mystery. That is great. One of the upsides for at least the United States and Britain is it's a huge business in the sense that foreigners come here. In my school, for example, private school, there was a significant number of foreigners in the school. I imagine they did not pay at reduced rates, as in they were Chinese, they were from South Korea and elsewhere. I think that's the case for Britain as well. But what do you think is the economics going of the classroom, so to speak? I talked about the internal economics of the classroom, but how much does this relate to the fact that that doesn't get critiqued? Swithin?
Oh yeah, I think that's certainly the case. I think actually you're definitely right. The English schools are private schools have quite a decent amount of very rich foreign kids there because of the market I'm in. I deal with a lot of private school students, and yeah, they're always say, yeah, we get the Saudis in, you get some of the Russians in there, Chinese. Occasionally you get some Africans there as well. But yeah, they definitely come over, and because it has such great sort of prestige. I think it's what Bryan Caplan says. Basically, what you have is with the education system is it has a signaling function. It allows you to signal to universities two things. Allow you to signal to employers if you have a good university degree. Two things: one, you're reasonably intelligent, and three, you actually work reasonably hard. Because that's really the only thing that a degree would tell you that an IQ test wouldn't tell you. If you want raw intelligence, now I know you can say, you can be intelligent in different ways, etc., etc. You specialize in certain amounts. So, some are better at verbal reasoning, others are better at sort of spatial awareness, etc., etc. Leave that aside. You could do sort of cognitive tests quite quickly and easily to ascertain raw skill, but figuring out kind of like a personality trait is kind of difficult as well. And I suppose as well, actually, getting a university degree shows that you're to some extent agreeable, because you'll be compliant, which of course is what an employer wants, because you don't want the worker to turn around and tell you're doing it all wrong, you should do it this way. Now, of course, you might want a few of those workers, but you don't want very many of them, because otherwise the organization will cease to function. But the question arises, though, why is it the case that universities have become the place where you signal the ability of somebody at the age of, say, 21? It seems a very odd way of doing it. I think the reason it has, to some extent, especially in the West, although less in the interesting question of why this is the case in the East. But in the West, I think to a large extent, it's child labor laws. There is no way you can prove your worth to an employer to any high degree without going through climbing up the university and sort of formal education system, because you're legally prohibited from showing your skills in the job market from a younger age. Ever since in the US, I think, interesting, was one of the cases where the Supreme Court overruled itself when it, I think it was certain aspects of federal regulation of child labor was one of them. They said that they couldn't do it on a federal level, and it was a state's role to do it, but then the federal government said, oh, no, so the Supreme Court said the federal government could do this. So I think one of the reasons it's done this is your kids can't work anywhere from like a youngish age. And the school leaving age progressively got older. I mean, when I was at school, it was 16 in England. Now it's been raised effectively to 18. Although I think to a large extent that might be a case of trying to stop younger people claiming unemployment benefit. I think that might be one of the reasons for that. Oh yeah, of course, that's another reason to keep people in the education system, is to keep the unemployment figures down. Because remember, if you are not actively searching for work, you are not unemployed. You're economically inactive. Nobody ever talks about economic inactivity figures, because the technical definition of unemployment is not the one that regular people use. But back to sort of compulsory attendance and child labour laws. I mean, back in the early 20th century, you could leave school at 12 or 14, but now it progressively gets older and older. And then, of course, if you want to differentiate yourself cognitively from your peers, you kind of have to go even higher to show that you're different. Whereas previously, you might have just gone to, like in America's term, graduate high school, whereas others would have dropped out earlier. And so there wouldn't be proportionally that many who had done it. That actually looks important, at least in the job market. Whereas now everyone gets more education. Well, to differentiate yourself from everybody else, you've got to do even more. So it's sort of like an arms race. But yeah, I think to a large extent, one of the reasons is child labour. You can't do this. And related to that, you could argue to some extent the social construction of adolescence. Now, some have argued that even childhood was kind of a social construction of the 20th century. Although I'm dubious of that. I think that's drawn on some relatively poor data sets to do that. I think one of them did it from paintings and said, oh, well, look, there are no children playing in these paintings. They're all working. Therefore, childhood as we understand it didn't exist. Now, did childhood exactly the same as we think it is today historically? Probably not. But, there does seem to be a clear demarcation being children and adults. But you didn't really have those in-between years, the teenagers, as it were. Seems to me to be a large extent of a combination of post-Second World War affluence and compulsory attendance laws, whereby previously they may have worked and now they couldn't. And so you had these sort of mini-adults, but not actually engaging in general adult society, which they would have done historically, say as apprentices or just in the workplace. And then, that creates some interesting sort of sociological outcomes. In that, whereas previously your peer group, your group who would be the main influence, the top of the tree in the social group, who tends to be older, etc., and maybe more mature and be sort of a better influence and a more mature influence in that sense. And then you get sort of these peer group leaders in sort of age segregated schools, especially the teen years, and they're the ones who drive what the other peers actually want to do and what they should be like, even though they're highly immature. And this is sort of quite a different situation than you would have had historically. And I think that kind of feeds into sort of like the teenage aspect. So Tim, that was a bit rambly, but any comments on what I've said so far?
Well, the invention of adolescence, or the invention of teenagerhood, is one of the more interesting concepts. I first heard about this a while back. I used to listen to some of the Albert Mohler stuff. I would just find intellectual and just listen to a bunch of his stuff. I did this with Left Wing. I did this with Albert Mohler. I just was a random guy I found on, I think, iTunes podcasts. And he interviewed the guy who one of the people who wrote the invention of adolescence. And this is where again it gets tricky, because in some ways I think certain child labor laws in industrial societies like United Kingdom and Britain in the late 1800s had some very virtuous aspects behind it. In some ways. Although in that regard it's even trickier. I mean, in my area, historically, I don't want to dox my location too much, but in my area, historically coal mining area, I was visiting a tourist historical mine, and I was looking at some of the ages that people entered the mine and like what levels of how much they could write. It wasn't a significant amount. I mean, it was about they'd enter some, depending on how affluent you had, you go in. So any youngest maybe one was 8. But by 12, 13, they were all in. And biologically, it's sort of spreading out. By that time, most people in general have some degree of, they're basically adults. That's a politically incorrect, including on the right in a certain way to say that. to say that people are basically adults. I mean, Marie Antoinette, I think, was like 14 or 15. So as far as age, and she got married. So what, as far as age is concerned, that in a way it's true. It is a construction. How we got there is a kind of complicated picture. I think if one's being fair to schools, though, they're not entirely at fault for certain things. This is where I think Thaddeus Russell and Michel Foucault, in a way, are correct. That in some ways, school functions as an insane asylum for a group of unruly people, which is the 12 to 18-year-olds, or possibly the 12 to 25-year-olds. Because modernity, modern civilization, is a kind of hyper-disciplined environment. If you look at the trees out front of some, like the French palaces, I think Foucault has a lecture on this. You see a perfectly straight tree that looks like a work of art. That it took years for that tree. They had to force that tree into a Procrustean bed to make those branches and those bushes look like that. I think thinking of modern citizens is a very similar way. Even for all the accusations that get thrown at the big left-wing intellectuals, they themselves are hyper-disciplined, including Thaddeus Russell and Foucault. Foucault is very well read. Actually, interesting, on the School Sucks podcast, one of the funny things is Thaddeus Russell was just going on about his book Renegades, history of people, the slackers created culture. And then they asked them, and what are you doing? Oh, I'm writing 2 new books. I'm working on starting the school. I'm working on 2 new papers. He's like, this sounds like the Protestant work ethic. So modern civilization is hyper disciplined. And this is where I think school is kind of a pressure cooker in that regard. So I do think some degree of fairness is warranted towards the schoolmasters. But if they're going to have the politics they do, I don't think any fairness is warranted. And I think brutalism and open agitation at all left-wing college professors. I mean, I actually can accept parochial schoolmasters. I think I said this on our police state episode. I mean, there's something more intuitive about the right. They have a sort of they have a relationship with power that is more Machiavellian at character. They're not going to win side. Now, whether or not libertarians have this problem is of some question. In this way, I would say libertarians are trying to take the role of neutrality. Whether or not we can actually occupy that role is of some question. But I would say that in my own experience, that school is a kind of pressure cooker in that regard. Just because you have these, you're half dependent, half independent. You're half on your parents, half not on your parents. Bar mitzvahs used to be at 12 to 13, which which is extremely young. I mean, many people can't even walk to school now. Now they do have free range parenting laws and so forth. But nonetheless, it is a problem. I do think people can drive cars. Should people be able to drive cars at 12? I don't know. I think in certain states, United States, it used to be like 14. That's one of the markers of independence in our society, is getting a driver's license. Since we have a sort of large car culture. More teenagers used to work, by the way. Now they work less, partly because school has more homework, from my understanding. I think homework has gone up. And that's another sort of negative side effect. I mean, I spent a little time in Asia teaching. And one of the reasons was I left is half the male students were on drugs. Not drugs like marijuana. I'm talking about like Ritalin and those drugs. That sort of horrified me. So there's a downside to the tiger mentality as well, of parents. Again, that was sort of a private school. It was more elite school. But there is sort of downsides to that. But what would you make so far of my comments about broader societal changes? And I want to go back to the point is, again, if some Aquinas, Augustinian wanted to set up, Cromwell wanted to set up an institution, I think there's sort of intuitive relationship that you have a telos, you have a strict telos, discipline. But I do think it's a bit rich when you have considering the ethos they claim to have, you have that, then they go down and grade them. So then, any other comments and extrapolations? So
Well, what you were saying about homework is interesting. Yeah, that's consistent with what I've read. That effectively school is now sort of taking over even the time you were at home, because what you must do is you must work at your school, which is the way it's kind of gone. And actually, this is, I think, related to, in part, what you could call the increased feminization of the education system. It's quite widely held now, but at least since the 1990s, that boys have done relatively less well in school than girls have. Why do I mention homework in this regard? Well, basically because women on average and girls are more conscientious and they're more agreeable. They won't just decide, lads will just say, well, we're not doing it, there's no point, and just won't do it. Whereas, if you have predominantly if you have female students, they'll just do it because that's what the teacher told them to do. And I think this actually relates, I think it's a point you've made before, how women fitted quite well into the corporate world these days because they're very good at efficiently organizing and running pre-existing organizations because they're agreeable, they get on with people, and they get things to tick along because they do what they're told. Whereas more traditionally male sort of virtues, etc., are sort of I'm going to say independence of mind, disagreeable, telling other people that they're wrong and actually there's better ways of doing things. Some more argumentative disposition is something that, despite what they claim to promote in schools, they don't, and of course is to a large extent bad in a corporate setting. So it's interesting to say about the Asian lads on Ritalin and stuff. This is, I think, one of the other problems with schools. Boys from like the age of 12, 13 don't want to stay still at all. It's bad enough at younger ages, but like they don't want to be sat still doing, or a lot of them don't want to be sat there and not doing anything active. And so by basically forcing them to sit at a desk for 6-7 hours a day is going to take a toll on their sort of behavior. And so then they're told, oh no, they're all bad, they can't learn anything. It's like, well, maybe if they couldn't then have to stay still all the time, they might actually be able to do something that was slightly better for them. And this, of course, also relates to people with general academic dispositions. There aren't actually that many people who have that. The idea that these people go, and this is another thing. Universities sort of portray themselves as great independent thinking organizations, and you're going to really plow the depths of minds historically, etc. That's what they claim. And then people who go to university think, oh yes, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to become a great deep critical thinker, etc. When all they really care about is getting laid, getting high, and getting a degree at the end of it so they can get a high-paying job. It's like duplicity from both the student body and the academic body, because really the number of people who have a generally academic disposition, and by academic I mean people who are generally interested in ideas for the sake of being interested in ideas, is very small. And so if you get those people in a context which that is ostensibly the goal. People think it's the goal, but probably, as we discussed, it isn't really the goal. They're not going to function particularly well in it, especially if you've got, the kids you were talking about, the lads, they were probably quite intelligent. But I'm thinking more here of the lower IQ sort of men who will teenagers, whatever we want to call them, are probably going to go into manual work. Why are they there? They could do far more interesting things. Now, I know you can say, as you pointed out, some of the child labour laws you could understand given how dangerous factories were, etc. But today, how many genuinely dangerous jobs are there that you can do? Everything has been health and safety up to the nth degree. But unless you're completely idiotic, or just a freak accident happens, you're probably not going to get injured that much in most jobs. I think the point you make, boys, is interesting. Especially, this is fun because the feminists will go, "Oh yeah, the boys doing better," but actually, still, everyone's really sexist and they're against women. It's like boys used to do better in school when they just had sort of exams at the end of the year and didn't do any coursework, because boys always did better that way. They don't work throughout the year. They get by, do as little as possible, and then cram and do really well in high-pressure situations, which, interestingly, is what typically women don't do very well in. But then they go to more coursework-based stuff. The girls do better, and then it's still sexism, and women are oppressed. But again, if you've got a way of getting money coming into you by claiming oppression, well, you aren't going to stop claiming oppression anytime soon. So Tim, what do you think about the sort of the sort of feminization of the education system and sort of the relationship between that and sort of the corporate culture?
I would agree with qualifications. Whether or not industrialism is a kind of feminization is a question that's probably worth an episode in itself. That to me is the broader issue, I think, at hand. Because I do think at times, to go back to, I am somewhat interested in the truth. I know that's a sort of dorky thing to say, sort of pretentious thing to say in a way, but I do have my own interests. I never really enjoyed school to a certain extent, but I think this is where I think things can get out of hand. But I do agree it's been feminized in that way. But I would say industrialization in certain ways has brought about changes. These sort of managerial. I think James Burnham, you get that sort of managerial revolution. And I mean, in this regard, you can't, the forces that led to these things, the forces that led to the creation of like the Pennsylvania Railroad or the British East India Company, the forces that led to these things are complicated and nebulous. So as far as, but yeah, schooling itself is extremely harsh on boys in that regard. And this is where I go back to harm. I think one of the unseen costs of it is we have less. We have people who basically at the end of education are totally fried to a certain extent and have no interest in education. It's only the true creative people that can do it. It's actually kind of a bad selector process in that regard. It selects quite poorly. And as far as manual labor jobs is concerned, I don't see anything. I don't see any harm. I mean, this is never the absurdity of the education system. And one of the reasons why we did this episode is again the pretentiousness and the sort of the some of the college professors it's somewhat ridiculous. I mean, they're in a system that basically and this is one of the problems of affirmative action here in the United States, is they get placed in schools that they don't belong in. They don't do very well, and they drop out. That's what John McWhorter said at the Reason debate. John McWhorter I'm not sure if he's an African descendant, but he's not white. So that's not coming from a black guy. It's not coming from a white guy like myself. So nonetheless, I do think it is harmful to certain groups, as also I think it harms because we don't get the sort of creative geniuses that we have. And as Tyler Cowan pointed out, we have a kind of stagnation. And I think a possible cause of the stagnation might be education system. Now, that's not a call to pump more money into the education system. It's the opposite. It's to pump people's time out of it. Pump people's time out of it, and more free range, more freedom. Although this goes back to the problem of 12 to 18-year-olds. They're somewhat of a modern invention. I mean, if you go into Amish country, you'll see children working out in the fields to some extent during some times of the year and various other areas. Is that child labor? I don't know. I wouldn't say so. I think that's a bit harsh to say. I would actually say that in some countries, they're in school from basically 7 to 7, 12 hours a day. I'm not really sure if that's worse off than being in a coal breaker for 12 hours a day. It's not entirely clear. I mean, in the coal mines and coal breakers, were physical jobs. You could stand up. You could, and as Thaddeus Russell would point out, many of these groups were just people would the whole. I mean, I've worked a few manual labor jobs. The environment is crass, lewd, and the discussions are generally. I mean, schoolyard, as Trump would say, locker room talk. So there is a certain kind of discourse that develops in slave gangs and coal breaker gangs and things like that, which is probably not much more conducive to 12 to 13-year-olds than some classroom led by a professor, led by a teacher with 10 years of education. But that, to me, to a certain extent, is a problem of industrialism. I don't think there was a committee of women that set out to, pull one. I know there might be some places there where it definitely obviously occurred, but I think if we're being fair, which I want to be fair because I do want to improve it, or I do want to end it, or in some ways abolish it or succeed, have people leave it, and I do think one should do that. But I think we have to have the correct diagnosis. But Swithin, any comments on my comments about the feminization of education?
Yes, I think I'm not wanting to lay the blame at industrialism per se. My point about corporations was primarily about corporate organizational size, and so I think the interesting question here would be whether or not you could have industrialization without increased concentration. I think that's one of the major points here. I think it's interesting you say about manual labor environments. This is too big of an issue to go into, but I think as well one of the interesting aspects of school, especially these days, is in that they are mixed sex institutions, and again I think that is probably to a large extent the detriment of both girls and boys, but I think particularly boys. Those sort of teen boys who'd because again sort of manual labor jobs, they're almost only going to be entirely male, and there's going to be a particular environment which they will thrive in and kind of enjoy, and they can sort of develop in there, which they would not be able to do in a mixed setting, and especially one where you have you're primarily taught by women, and that's typically true, especially at the lower ages these days. Less so in universities, but certainly in elementary or primary as it is in England, and middle school. So I think that's certainly true. I'd like to thank everyone now for listening. We will get to another episode in education shortly about what education really is, what it's for, and how we could kind of envisage it being different to the current situation today. I think Russ Roberts of Econ Talk is someone who thinks that the education system is one of the things that's holding sort of America and sort of Britain, as it were, back from developing and leading to the stagnation that Tyler Cowan mentioned. So if you've liked this episode, please subscribe to us on YouTube and on Spotify and also on Podbean, and share it with your friends and family. And if any of you'd like to give us any comments or contact us with ideas for the show, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.